In the glass lobby of Europe's leading financial corporation, dozens of employees bowed their heads as the youngest female CEO in the country walked in. Olivia Ward, 34 years old, self-made billionaire, famous for never failing. While waiting for the elevator, she noticed an elderly janitor mopping the floor. Slow movements, faded uniform. She asked, half joking, half mocking, "If you were me, how would you invest without losing a single penny?" Her assistants laughed quietly. The old man looked up, eyes calm. "I would start by not looking down on the value of a single penny." No one dared breathe loudly. Olivia Ward was 34 years old, CEO of Ward Global Financial, cold, brilliant, always in control of everything. Thomas Hale was 63, janitor at Ward Tower, thin frame, silver hair, kind eyes, rarely spoke, always cleaning quietly each morning. Olivia had come from poverty, had been looked down upon, so when she succeeded, she swore she'd never be weak again. She devoted her entire life to numbers, forgot about emotions entirely. Thomas, the cleaner on the 50th floor, everyone thought was just an ordinary old man. He always arrived early, sat drinking coffee alone in the corner of the lobby. One morning, Olivia arrived earlier than usual and saw him mopping the floor, muttering calculations on a scrap of paper. "What are you doing?" she asked, half curious. He looked up with a gentle smile. "I'm calculating if I save £1 every day, after 20 years, I could buy a small house." She laughed. £1 means nothing in this world," he simply smiled back. "For someone who's never had anything, £1 is all hope." She paused, something shifting uncomfortably in her chest. The next day at the company breakfast, she joked, "Mr. Thomas, if you were me, how would you invest without losing money?" He looked up, answered simply, "I would start by not looking down on the value of a single penny." The sentence left the entire room silent. Olivia had built her empire from scratch, clawed her way up from a childhood where electricity was a luxury and meals were never guaranteed. She'd learned early that emotions were liabilities, that softness got you crushed, that the only way to survive was to be harder, smarter, colder than everyone else. By 34, she'd succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. But somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. She measured worth in quarterly earnings, valued people by their productivity metrics, saw the world through spreadsheets and profit margins. Thomas had been cleaning Ward Tower for 5 years. Most employees never noticed him, walking past as if he were furniture, invisible in his uniform. He didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that being unseen had its advantages. People spoke freely around those they considered beneath notice, and he heard everything. The corporate gossip, the desperate ambitions, the quiet cruelties of power. He mopped floors and listened, and sometimes when he was alone, he'd sit with his coffee and remember a different life. The morning after the breakfast incident, Olivia found herself watching Thomas more carefully. She noticed how he moved with deliberate precision, how he treated every task with dignity, how he nodded politely to everyone regardless of their rank. There was something about him, a stillness, a presence that didn't match his position. She told herself she was being ridiculous, projecting depth onto an old man who cleaned floors for minimum wage. But the question nagged at her. Why had his words felt like they'd struck something deep and true? The mark of a real person. A receptionist later recalled, "I once saw him pick up coins from the floor that others had dropped, not embarrassed at all when people laughed. He said, 'If you don't treasure small things, how can you keep great ones?'" Another employee added, "Mr. Thomas never eats lunch with the rest of us. He brings leftovers from home, saves every penny. But last Christmas, he gave each of the cleaning staff a small bonus from his own pocket. When I asked why, he said, 'I'm not rich, but I was once poor in spirit, and I don't want anyone to feel that way.'" Thomas Hale was a man with a past no one expected. After that morning, Olivia couldn't forget the look in the old man's eyes. She had her assistant pull his employment records, but there was nothing beyond basic information, hired 5 years ago. References checked, no red flags. She decided to visit the staff break room in the basement, where Thomas drank stale coffee from a chipped ceramic mug that looked older than he was. I want to hear more of your advice, she said, half serious, half teasing. Thomas looked up, smiled kindly. About investing or about people? She raised an eyebrow. You think those are different things? Not really. People make bad investments not because they lack money, but because they don't understand value. She fell silent, uncomfortable with how easily he'd turned her question back on her. Do you know why I work as a janitor? He asked. Because you need money? She assumed. No. Because I once had too much money and I lost everything. Olivia went completely still. He continued, 20 years ago, I was the chief financial officer of a major company. When the crisis hit, I sold everything trying to save myself, lost it all. My wife left. My daughter died in an accident. He stared into his coffee. I realized I'd calculated every number except loneliness. She looked at him, feeling ashamed of her cold tone for the first time in years. Ms. Ward, have you ever asked yourself why you work? Because I have to prove I'm good enough. To whom? The question made her throat tighten. She'd never thought about it, just assumed the answer was obvious. But sitting there in the dingy basement break room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, she realized she didn't know. Her parents were dead. She had no siblings, no close friends, no one whose approval she sought. She was proving herself to ghosts, to memories of people who'd called her worthless, to the world that had tried to crush her. Thomas seemed to understand her silence. When I lost everything, I spent 2 years wanting to die. I'd go to the bridge every night, look down at the water, try to find courage. But I was too much of a coward even for that. One night, a homeless man asked me for change. I had nothing, told him so. He looked at me and said, then give me your time. Talk to me so I don't feel alone. We sat together until dawn. He saved my life without knowing it, taught me that value isn't measured in currency. Why are you telling me this? Olivia asked, voice softer than usual. Because you remind me of my daughter. She was brilliant, driven, so desperate to prove she mattered that she forgot to actually live. She worked herself to exhaustion, neglected her health, died in a car accident driving home after a 70-hour work week. He paused, tears threatening. The day before she died, she told me she'd finally made senior analyst. She was so proud. I told her I was proud too. But what I should have said was, rest, slow down. Your life is worth more than any title. Olivia felt something crack inside her chest. What was her name? Sarah Hale. She worked here actually in your company, 5 years ago. Olivia's breath caught. I remember her. She was the analyst who kept sending me suggestions, ideas about employee wellness programs and work-life balance. I dismissed them as soft thinking. Thomas nodded slowly. She admired you greatly, said you were everything she wanted to be. That's why I took this job, to be close to where she spent her last years, to understand what drove her, what drove you. They sat in silence, the weight of revelation settling between them. Finally, Olivia spoke. Mr. Thomas, would you have coffee with me? Real coffee, not this terrible break room stuff. In my office, tomorrow morning. He smiled. Only if you stop calling me Mr. Thomas. Just Thomas is fine. She smiled back, a real smile, not the corporate one she perfected. Only if you stop calling me Ms. Ward. Olivia is fine. Over the following weeks, their morning coffee meetings became routine. Thomas would arrive at 7 a.m., knock on her door, and they'd sit by the window, overlooking the city, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his wife, how they'd met in university, how she'd left not because she stopped loving him, but because he'd become someone she didn't recognize, consumed by ambition and fear. She told him about growing up poor, about the shame of wearing secondhand clothes to school, about the teacher who told her she'd never amount to anything because poverty was a mindset, not just a circumstance. You proved that teacher wrong, Thomas observed. Did I? Olivia looked at her reflection in the window. Or did I just become rich while staying poor in the ways that matter? Thomas considered this. Sarah used to say the same thing about you. She'd watch you in meetings, see how you never smiled, never showed vulnerability, and she'd say, she's terrified someone will see she's human. I didn't understand then. I do now. Olivia turned to him. What changed? You did. You asked a janitor for advice. You laughed at yourself. You're trying, and trying is where change begins. The mark of a real person. A colleague of Thomas recalled, he always shared his small bonuses with other staff, even though his own salary was minimal. He said, I'm not rich, but I was once poor in spirit, and I don't want anyone to feel that way. Another cleaner added, Thomas never talked about his past, but you could tell he'd lived a bigger life once. The way he understood financial reports we'd find in the trash, the way he'd help us with our taxes and budgets. He was teaching us without us knowing we were students. When real crisis came, the advice that seemed foolish saved the entire corporation. 1 week later, Ward Global fell into a severe liquidity crisis. Olivia's aggressive investment in emerging markets had backfired spectacularly. A political coup in Southeast Asia, wiping out 40% of their portfolio value overnight. The board was in chaos, demanding mass layoffs to cut losses, shareholders calling for her resignation, media speculation about the youngest female CEO's spectacular failure already trending on financial news. Olivia didn't sleep for 3 nights straight. She ran scenarios, crunched numbers, consulted with the best analysts money could buy. Every solution led to the same conclusion: sacrifice people to save the company. Fire hundreds of employees, gut the workforce, survive at the cost of the very people who'd built the empire. On the 4th morning, hollow-eyed and desperate, she went down to the lobby and found Thomas mopping the same spot he'd been mopping for 5 years. You don't need to look far to save the company, he said, without looking up. What do you mean, she asked, voice hoarse from exhaustion. You think the problem is money, but really it's trust. Trust? When people are afraid, they sell the future just to hold on to the present. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and covered in handwritten formulas. This is a micro-bond restructuring model. It's simple: decentralize your debt, offer direct bonds to your employees and loyal clients, people who believe in the company's mission, not just quarterly returns. Olivia stared at the paper. This is microfinance theory applied to corporate restructuring. Where did you learn this? I designed it, Thomas said quietly 20 years ago to save my old company before they fired me for suggesting it. They called it radical, said it would never work, because it required trusting ordinary people with financial instruments typically reserved for institutional investors. But you know what the real reason was? It would have required admitting that regular employees understood value better than executives who'd never struggled. She studied the model, mind racing. It was brilliant, almost insultingly simple. Instead of massive institutional bailouts with crushing terms, they'd issue small bonds directly to stakeholders, employees who wanted job security, clients who wanted stability, community members who wanted to see the company survive. Lower individual risk, distributed trust, collective investment, and shared future. The math worked, the psychology was sound, but it required something Olivia had never been good at: asking for help, admitting vulnerability, trusting people. Why are you giving this to me? She asked. Thomas finally looked up and she saw tears in his eyes. Because Sarah died believing in this company. Because you remind me of her. Because someone has to break the cycle of fear before it breaks more people. He handed her the paper. Use it or don't. But remember, the strongest foundations aren't built on stone. They're built on people who choose to hold each other up. Olivia took the model to her board. They laughed, called it naive, said employees were liabilities, not investors. That desperation had made her lose perspective. She fired 3 of them on the spot. The remaining board members went silent. I'm implementing this plan, she said, voice steel. Anyone who disagrees can leave now. No one moved. Over the next month, Ward Global launched the Trust Forward initiative, offering bonds to employees at preferential rates, creating community investment opportunities, opening financial participation to people typically excluded from such instruments. The media called it revolutionary. Financial analysts called it insane. Employees called it hope. Within 60 days, the company was oversubscribed. Employees investing their savings because they believed in the mission. Clients buying bonds because they trusted the people they'd worked with for years. Even Thomas invested his modest savings, telling Olivia, "I'm betting on you the way I wish someone had bet on me." The restructuring worked, not because of complex financial engineering, but because people invested in something they believed in. 3 months later, the stock had recovered. 6 months later, they'd hit new highs. The board, now entirely replaced with leaders who shared Olivia's vision, asked her to explain the turnaround at the annual shareholder meeting. She stood at the podium in front of hundreds of investors and said something no CEO had said before. "This formula wasn't mine. It belonged to the man who mops the floors on the 50th floor. His name is Thomas Hale, and 20 years ago, brilliant executives fired him for being too idealistic. Today, that idealism saved this company." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Olivia gestured to the wings. Thomas stood there in his janitor uniform, looking uncomfortable and proud. She continued, "Mr. Hale taught me that value doesn't come from how much you extract, but from how much you trust. That the smallest investments in people, in dignity, in listening, compound into wealth money can't measure. Ward Global is restructuring not just our finances, but our values. From today forward, every employee, from executive to janitor, has equal voice in quarterly innovation meetings." The shareholders were silent, uncertain whether to applaud or revolt. Then one person stood, an elderly woman who'd invested with the company for 30 years, and began clapping. Others joined slowly, then the entire room was standing. Thomas stood backstage crying, and Olivia left the podium to stand beside him. "Thank you," she whispered. "For Sarah," he replied. "For both of you, the mark of a real person." A financial analyst who attended the meeting later wrote, "I've covered corporate events for 20 years and never seen a CEO bow to a janitor, but Olivia Ward did." She bowed deeply, with genuine respect, and the man bowed back. In that moment, you could feel the entire culture of Ward Global shift. Another employee recalled after the announcement, Thomas went back to mopping floors. People asked why he didn't retire or take a promotion. He said, "I'm good at this job and someone has to do it. Besides, I like being where I can listen to people. That's how you hear truth." After the crisis, Olivia began to change in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She established the Listening Fund, a program where any employee, security guard, cleaner, receptionist could submit ideas for company improvement. Every suggestion was reviewed seriously, and implementable ideas earned their creators both recognition and financial bonuses. Within the first month, they received over 300 submissions. Within 3 months, they'd implemented 17 ideas that improved efficiency and employee satisfaction more than any consultant's report ever had. Every week, Olivia went down to the basement to have coffee with Thomas. Not the imported espresso from her office machine, but the terrible break room coffee that tasted like burned rubber and regret. "You know," she said one morning, "I finally understand your first words to me." "Which ones?" "Don't look down on the value of a single penny. It turns out I was looking down on people like you." Thomas smiled gently. "Actually, I was never angry with you, because I saw my daughter in you, strong to the point of forgetting you're tired." "Your daughter," Olivia said quietly. "She worked for Ward Global, didn't she?" "Before the accident. Her name was Sarah Hale." Thomas nodded. "She was the only person who ever sent me emails saying the company needed to listen more." "I remember," Olivia whispered. "I deleted them without reading. Thought they were soft thinking from someone who didn't understand business." Thomas looked out the small basement window at the gray London sky. "Now you're doing what she wanted. You're listening." They sat in comfortable silence, two people bound by tragedy and transformation. Finally, Olivia asked the question she'd been holding. "Why do you still work here, Thomas? You could retire, live comfortably on your employee bonds. They're worth quite a lot now." He smiled. "Because someone has to remember that every floor matters, not just the top one. Because when I mop, people forget I'm there and speak honestly. Because I've learned more about this company from cleaning conference rooms than I ever learned in boardrooms." One afternoon, during a company town hall, A young analyst asked Olivia how she changed her leadership style so dramatically. She paused, looking at Thomas standing in the back in his uniform. "I learned from the smartest person in this building, someone who understands that wealth isn't what you have, it's what you give away. That power isn't controlling everything, it's empowering everyone. That the best investment you can make is in human dignity." The analyst followed her gaze. "You mean Mr. Thomas?" Olivia smiled. "I mean exactly Mr. Thomas." The changes rippled through Ward Global. Employee satisfaction scores hit record highs. Turnover dropped to nearly zero. Productivity increased not because people were working longer hours, but because they cared about the work. The company became a case study in business schools, an example of how valuing people could coexist with profitability. Other CEOs called Olivia for advice, and she'd tell them the same thing. Hire a janitor as your consultant. You'll learn more in a week than from any MBA program. Thomas's health began declining that winter. He'd been working through pain for months, never complaining. But Olivia noticed how he moved more slowly, how he took longer breaks, how his skin had taken on a gray pallor. She insisted he see the company doctor. And when the diagnosis came, congestive heart failure, advanced, she felt the ground shift beneath her. "How long?" she asked the doctor. 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. Thomas just smiled. More time than I expected, honestly. Olivia wanted to give him everything. Best doctors, experimental treatments, whatever money could buy. He refused it all. "I've lived my life," he said gently. "Let me finish it my way." But she could give him one thing. She promoted him to Chief Cultural Officer, a newly created position with a real salary and full benefits. He laughed. "I'm still gonna mop floors. That's where I do my best work." She hugged him, this old man who'd saved her company and her soul. "Then mop floors as Chief Cultural Officer. Just don't leave yet. I still need you. From today, I choose to look at others longer than a heartbeat, to see their struggles, their wisdom, their worth, regardless of their title or position. I will live with humility, remembering that the greatest teachers often wear the simplest uniforms, and the most profound wisdom comes from those who've lost everything and chosen to give anyway." 1 year later, Thomas Hale passed away from heart failure, peacefully in his sleep, in the small apartment he'd never wanted to leave despite Olivia's offers of better accommodations. He left behind a handwritten letter for Olivia, delivered by his lawyer. "Ms. Ward, thank you for saving not just the company, but the faith of small people like me. If one day you feel tired, remember this. The value of a penny lies in how you use it, not in how many you have. Invest in people, not numbers. With love, Thomas." Olivia attended the funeral. It was small, just a handful of cleaning staff, a few employees who'd worked with Sarah, and Olivia herself. She gave the eulogy, voice trembling. "This man taught me the lesson no university could provide, that the truly wealthy are those who know how to listen." He never stopped seeing value in what others dismissed. He saved a company by trusting people who'd been told they didn't matter. She placed something on the casket, a single shining penny, the first one Thomas had ever given her, polished until it gleamed like gold. Several months after his death, Ward Global redesigned their corporate logo. The new symbol showed a hand lifting a single coin, representing their philosophy. True value comes from small things. In the lobby where Thomas had once mopped floors, they installed a bronze statue, an old man with a mop, looking up with kind eyes. The plaque read, "Thomas Hale, 1960 to 2024. He taught us that wisdom wears many uniforms." On Olivia's desk, she kept the worn paper with Thomas's handwritten formula, framed beside a photo of him and Sarah together, back when he'd been a CFO and she'd been a girl with dreams. Every morning before meetings, she'd touch the frame and whisper, "I'm still learning, still listening, still trying to honor what you taught me." The company had transformed, but more importantly, so had she. Employees no longer feared her. They respected her, loved her even, because she'd learned to show them the same respect. One morning, a new janitor, a young woman from Somalia, knocked hesitantly on Olivia's door. "Yes," Olivia asked, smiling. The woman held out a piece of paper covered in careful handwriting. "I have idea for saving water in building, but I don't know if you want to hear from cleaner." Olivia stood, gestured to the chair Thomas used to occupy. "Please," said, "tell me everything. I've learned that the best ideas come from people who do the work." As the young woman explained her water conservation system, brilliant and simple, Olivia thought about Thomas, about how he'd stood in the same office, teaching a frightened billionaire that wealth measured in humanity was the only kind that mattered, about how one man mopping floors had changed an entire company's soul. She implemented the janitor's idea the following week, crediting her by name, offering her a bonus and a promotion to environmental consultant. The city lights sparkled through her office window as evening fell over London. Olivia stood looking at the view she'd once thought proved her success. Now she understood. Success wasn't the corner office or the title or the billions. It was the young Somali woman whose idea would save thousands of gallons of water. It was the employees who trusted her because she had finally learned to trust them. It was Thomas's voice in her memory, reminding her that value lives in the smallest gestures, that one penny in the right hands could change the world. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, if you believe that wisdom comes from unexpected places and that listening matters more than speaking, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell the stories that should never be forgotten, about ordinary people who teach extraordinary lessons, about pennies that hold infinite worth, about janitors who save corporations and CEOs who finally learn to see.